Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. For there has already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on in unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and lawless idolatry. They are surprised that you don't join with them in the same flood of wild living, and they slander you. They will give an account to the one who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was also preached to those who are now dead, so that although they might be judged in the flesh according to human standards, they might live in the spirit according to God's standards. The end of all things is near, therefore, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. Above all, maintain consistent love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining, just as the one who has received a gift use it to serve others, as good stewards of the varied grace of God. If anyone speaks, let it be as one who speaks God's words. If anyone serves, let it be from the strength God provides, so that God may be glorified through Jesus Christ in everything. To him be the glory and the power forever. Amen.
Father, we come to you not out of routine or ritual, but because we need you, O God. I need you. And so, Lord, we do ask, Lord, for your grace to be with us tonight as we hear from your word. Grant us ears to hear what you have to say to us tonight. And Lord, let it convict, let it bring encouragement. And Lord, I pray that through it all, O God, your name be glorified. So be with us and speak to us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, friends, how should we then live? Right, that's the title of Francis Schaeffer's famous book, and that's the question that Peter, I believe, is addressing us tonight. Well, friends, we have been making our way through the book of 1 Peter, and just by way of a review and recap, we have seen in the first major section of the letter, from chapter 1, verse 1, through to chapter 2, verse 10, right, Peter reminds us of the living hope and the new identity that we have in Christ. Right, we are chosen exiles, we are a royal priesthood. And in the second major section of the letter, from 2:11 all the way through to the end of our passage today, right, Peter gets practical. He gives instruction on how we ought to live our lives as chosen exiles in this hostile world. For example, how we ought to relate to the wider society and so forth. In our passage this evening, right, Peter brings this conclusion of the letter to a close, and after reminding us last week of the confident hope that we have because of the victory of Christ, right, he gives us now a renewed exhortation on how we should live faithfully in this world. And what Peter wants us to see this evening is this. Faithful living in a hostile world entails living resolutely for the will of God and living appropriately in light of the end. Right? Living resolutely for the will of God and living appropriately in light of the end. Right? This will be our 2-point outline for today. So without further ado, let's walk through the text and let's take each of these sections in turn. Firstly, faithful living entails living for the will of God. Look with me at verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. Friends, Peter's main command in this passage is clear. Right? We are to arm ourselves. Right? This is a verb with military connotations. Right? The image here is that of soldiers girding themselves, preparing themselves, and getting themselves ready for battle. Just think about it, friends. What do soldiers do as they prepare to go for battle? I don't think you have to be in an army to know what to do, right? Soldiers, they ensure that they have the necessary equipment, that they are armed, that they are sufficiently equipped for battle. For to do otherwise would be to go on a suicide mission, so to speak. So Peter commands us here to arm ourselves. But with what are we to arm ourselves? Well, verse 1 tells us we are to arm ourselves with the same understanding. That is, with the same mindset and the same attitude, the same intentions as that of Christ. And what exactly is that? Well, as you'll soon see later, it's none other than the resolve, the readiness, the commitment to suffer for the will of God. Right, so Peter's point here is this: just as soldiers prepare and equip themselves for battle, so too are believers to prepare and equip themselves to suffer. All right, this is the mindset that we should have as believers. We're not to be caught off guard, but we are to have a wartime mentality. We are to arm ourselves with the attitude that suffering is inevitable. We are to prepare ourselves for it. And this is needed, friends, if we are to survive the persecution and suffering that may come our way as believers. So friends, a good question to ask ourselves at this juncture is this: is that our mindset? Are we armed? Are we ready? Are we prepared for the suffering that may come our way as believers? Or will we be caught off guard? Will we be surprised and shocked and stunned by what happens? But friends, Peter doesn't just tell us to arm ourselves with the mindset of Christ. You know, like a good pastor, he gives us two reasons why we ought to do so. And the first is the example of Christ. Notice how Peter begins verse 1. He writes, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding." Did you catch that, friends? Right, Peter is once again drawing a connection between the sufferings that we may experience as believers with the suffering of Christ. More specifically, Peter is grounding his command to arm ourselves with a readiness to suffer in the fact that Christ himself had suffered in the flesh. In other words, just as Jesus willingly suffered according to God's will, just as Jesus resolved to let nothing stand in the way in his endeavor to bring us back to God, a resolve and determination that can be seen most evidently in his setting his face, a Semitic idiom that speaks of a firm and unshakable resolve to go to Jerusalem where he will be crucified and die on our behalf for our sins. So too should we, as his blood-bought people, resolve to suffer for the cause of Christ. For friends, the thing is this: if Christ, our Master and Lord, suffered, so too will we, as his followers, suffer. After all, Jesus himself tells us, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. On the words of Paul, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Simply put, friends, suffering is inevitable in the Christian life. So, we are to arm ourselves with a readiness to suffer. For in so doing, we are walking in the footsteps, we are following the example of our Lord himself. But Peter doesn't stop there. Right? He gives us a second reason why we should arm ourselves with such a mindset. And it is this: it evidences that we have made a decisive break with sin, that we are done with sin. Look at verse 1 again. Peter writes, "Arm yourselves with the same understanding." Why? Because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin. Now, friends, this is a perplexing phrase. What does it mean that the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with sin? Well, friends, what we can immediately discount is the interpretation that Peter is teaching some sort of sinless perfection that believers can attain in this life. That is the teaching that believers can be completely free of sin in this life. But there are many verses, but just one verse will dispel this myth. 1 John 1, verse 8. Right, the Apostle John, writing to believers, writes, "If we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us." So friends, Peter is clearly not teaching some sort of sinless perfection in this verse. Right? But if that's not what Peter means, what then does Peter mean by this phrase? Well, friends, I think Peter's point is that our commitment to suffer for the gospel, our willingness to endure scorn and mockery for our faith, is evidence that we are done with sin, that we have broken with sin, that we have parted company with sin. Now, perhaps we can think of it this way. Picture picture two paths. Right? One broad and easy, namely the path of conformity, in which we go with the flow of cultural and societal norms just to avoid being persecuted for the faith. And the other, narrow and hard, namely the path of non-conformity, in which obedience to God and not culture comes at a cost. And what Peter is saying here is that our very willingness to take the narrow and hard path, the path in which we gladly bear the reproach of Christ and suffer on his behalf, is an indication that our faith is real, that we are done with sin, that we are committed to a new way of living, a life that is lived for and unto Christ. It's like the old hymn, I forgot the hymn, I wanted to say, the cross before me, the world behind me, no turning back. All right, that's the hymn that I was thinking about. Right, living unto Christ alone. So this is another reason why we should arm ourselves with a readiness to suffer, for it reveals that we have broken with a life of sin. And friends, let's not miss this, for I think this is what Peter is trying to get at in all of this. Notice the goal, the purpose of arming ourselves. Verse 2, he says, in order to live the remaining time in the flesh, no longer for human desires, but for God's will. In other words, arming ourselves with the same resolve as Jesus is necessary if we want to live our lives for the will of God and not for our human desires. Friends, note the word but, which indicates a contrast between God's will and human desires. Right? It's like two opposing forces, so to speak, that tug at our affections, that seek our allegiance. And this is why Peter constantly warns us about our desires in this letter. For example, 1 Peter 1:14, he warns us, he says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance. And in 1 Peter 2:11, he says, dear friends, I urge you, as strangers and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires that wage war against the soul. Friends, it's a war, it's a battle. Right? There are no two ways about it. If we want to live for the will of God and not for human desires, we must arm ourselves with the mindset of Christ, with his resolve and readiness to suffer. And it requires a commitment on our part. We have to be resolute in this. Verse 3, Peter goes on to elaborate why we should live the rest of our lives for God's will rather than for our human desires. He says, for there's already been enough time spent in doing what the Gentiles choose to do, carrying on in unrestrained behavior, evil desires, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and lawless idolatry. Right? Peter is blunt and straightforward here. In essence, what he's saying is this. He's saying enough is enough. Right? You spend enough time living that way. Stop it. Right? Stop doing what the Gentiles, that is, what unbelievers do. And then he goes on to give us a list, while by no means exhaustive, that describes the lifestyle of unbelievers, activities that we do well to avoid. Right? You won't go through the list in detail, but even a cursory look at this list on the screen will reveal that not much has changed since Peter's day. Right? These vices are still as prevalent today as it was back then in the first century. And these are activities that whether or not we have been engaged in them in the past, we have to leave behind, abstain from, and to put away. For not to do so will be akin to what Peter says in his second epistle, in 2 Peter 2:22, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow returns to wallowing in the mud. Right? A vivid and grotesque picture that I believe makes its point. Friends, as Christians, we must be done with sin, and we are to live for the will of God. But friends, Peter is not naive. He knows that our commitment to live for the will of God comes at a cost. Look at verse 4. He writes, they are surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of wild living, and they slander you. Now, friends, my guess is that perhaps some, if not most of us here, can relate to what Peter is saying here. And it is here, I believe, that our identity as chosen exiles come to the fore, or is most keenly felt. You know, that's the price that we have to pay for being chosen exiles in this hostile world. You know, we've said it before, that as God's chosen exiles, we march to a different drumbeat, a heavenly drumbeat. And therefore, we don't quite fit in with the ways, customs, and values of the world. Right? We are different. And it is inevitable that we stand out like a sore thumb. So unbelievers are surprised that we don't join them in what they do. Still remember a time when I was a relatively young leader of a student group. We had organized a social event, a barbecue at Roma Street Parklands, in bid to reach out to the new students who had come over from overseas. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I remember going around talking to the different new students, and in one of the groups, I'm not sure what happened or how the conversation developed, but I suddenly got scorned and laughed at for not having slept around. And these were by, I think it was 2 girls talking to me back then. The surprise of the students I was talking to was palpable. I mean, I was surprised back then that they were surprised, which on hindsight, I should not have been surprised. But, I can't remember how I responded back then. I think I could have responded in a better way. But this incident has ever since been etched in my mind. And I'm reminded of it each time I read this verse. They are surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of wild living. And friends, the thing is this. If you've been a Christian for a long time, or maybe some time, you probably have a similar story to tell. Our refusal to join unbelievers in what they do leaves them surprised. They are dumbfounded. They find us weird, they find us strange. And they wonder why we don't give in, why we deny ourselves the desires and the pleasures of our flesh. They might tease us, they might even ostracize us. But it doesn't stop there. It gets worse. Paul says that some may even slander or malign us. That is, they verbally abuse, attack, and speak evil of us. And friends, if you think about it, perhaps they act in such an antagonistic way is because they feel implicitly judged or indicted by our actions, even without us saying a word. Our non-participation in their activities leave them condemned, so to speak. And friends, the thing is this. Like it or not, given the times in which we are living, things are going to get worse. The exclusive claims of Christ are never going to sit well with society. If we're going to make a stand for the sanctity of life, if we're going to seek to defend God's definition and design of marriage or whatever else, then we had better to be prepared to cop a backlash, even persecution from society. We'll be thought of as bigoted, we'll be thought of as intolerant. We've seen it in City Point Christian College, and we'll see it, sadly, even more in the days to come. We will be slandered, we will be maligned, we will be ostracized, we might lose our jobs, we might be imprisoned, we might even be killed. And that's the situation that Peter's readers faced in the first century, and that's the situation that we are facing today in the 21st century. And that's why Peter starts off by commanding us to arm ourselves with the mindset and resolve of Christ, to have a readiness and willingness to live for God's will and to suffer like Christ, for such a time will come. Well, so far we have seen that living for God's will requires a commitment to arm ourselves with the mindset of Christ. And it has a cost as well, a cost of persecution and suffering. And it seems like a huge commitment and a high cost, and it is. So Peter turns next to encourage us by reminding us of the comfort that we can have even in the face of unjust suffering. Verse 5, he writes, "They will give an account to the one who stands ready to judge the living and the dead." In fact, what Peter is doing here is to lift our eyes off our present circumstances and direct them to the eschaton, to the future judgment that is to come. Right? Peter wants us to take the long view and eternal view of things. He's reminding us that God, the judge, is standing at the door, ready to judge the living and the dead. In other words, all people, without exception, will be judged, and death does not exempt one from judgment. And when that time comes, God will right all wrongs, He will punish all sin, and He will hold unbelievers accountable for their actions. Of this, we can be assured. Now, Peter's goal here is to strengthen and fortify the hearts of believers. He wants to encourage us to stand firm and not succumb in the face of unjust suffering or in the wake of societal pressures. He wants to encourage us to continue living for the will of God and to entrust ourselves, come what may, to the one who judges justly, knowing that justice will be served. Verse 6, "For this reason, the gospel was also preached to those who are now dead, so that although they might be judged in the flesh according to human standards, they might live in the Spirit according to God's standards. Now, this is, again, a somewhat confusing verse, but what most scholars think is happening here is this. Perhaps unbelievers back then, they were mocking the Christian faith. Perhaps they were saying that there's no difference between believers and unbelievers since both experience death in the same way. Perhaps they were saying, see, you don't enjoy life and indulge yourself in the way that we do. In fact, you foolishly suffer for your faith. And to what end? You die just like us. And what's the point of your faith? And Peter is here reminding believers, no, that's not true. The gospel does make a difference. All right, Peter says this is the reason why the gospel was preached to those who are now dead. A phrase that we saw last week does not refer to the preaching of the gospel to those who are now in hell, giving them a second chance of repentance. We know that's not true because there's no such thing as post-mortem conversion. Or, as some argue, preaching to the spiritually dead. But rather, I think, it's referring to those who heard and believed the gospel while alive, but who have since died. And Peter is saying the reason why the gospel was preached is so that, judged in the flesh, that is, although we die physically like everyone else, death is not the final word for believers. We will be raised from the dead just as Jesus was raised from the dead. In fact, I'm not sure about you, but what an encouragement, what an incentive this is to persevere in living for the will of God, no matter how difficult it may be, and not to succumb to the fleeting pleasures of the flesh. And by the way, as a side note as well, I think this should spur us as well to have an urgency in our evangelism, to reach out to the lost, to share the gospel with those who have yet to know Christ, so that they too may come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And those of you in my midst today, we'll get you here with us. If not come to know Jesus for yourself, to speak to someone, we'll share the gospel with you, and we'll pray that you'll come to know the Lord for yourself as well. Right, so that's the first thing. Faithful living entails living resolutely for the will of God. Secondly, faithful living entails living in light of the end. And here Peter now turns his attention from how believers ought to live in relation to outsiders to how believers ought to live in relationship with one another. Look at verse 7. Right, Peter begins this second section with these attention-grabbing words. He says, the end of all things is near, like a doomsday prophet. Now, some people may be thinking, wait a minute, almost 2,000 years have passed since Peter penned these words. And the end has not yet come. We're still living, we're still breathing, eating, drinking, and whatever else. So is Peter deluded and misguided? Well, the answer is no. Right, what Peter has in mind when he says the end of all things is near is that we are living in the final stage of redemptive history. Right, we are living in the end of days, we're living in the last days. Days that the resurrection and ascension of Christ has inaugurated. And so what Peter is saying is simply this. He's saying that the consummation of all things is at hand, and Jesus could return at any moment. So friends, with the imminent return of Jesus in view, the question then becomes, how then should we live? How should we live in light of his impending return? And what Peter does in these remaining verses is he gives us 4 exhortations on how we ought to live faithfully as a community of believers in light of the end. Right? 4 activities that we ought to give ourselves to as the end draws near. And what we find is that these are nothing extraordinary or spectacular, but they are ordinary and mundane. Notice what Peter says. Right? He says that we are to be vigilant in prayer, earnest in love, joyful in hospitality, and faithful in service. Right, these are pretty straightforward. So let's just briefly run through each of these as we remind ourselves of what we ought to be committed to as a community of believers here at GBC. So firstly, we are to be vigilant in prayer. Look at verse 7. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and sober-minded for prayer. Friends, Peter is clear. Since the end of all things is at hand, we are to be alert and sober-minded. Now, some people may realize that this word sober-minded is, a common theme in this epistle of Peter's. And it's something that we do well to cultivate in our Christian life. This word appears 2 other times in this letter. 1 Peter 1:13, Peter writes, therefore, with your minds ready for action, be sober-minded and set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And in 1 Peter 5:8, the famous verse, which we'll see next time, be sober-minded and alert. Same words. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone he can devour. So friends, it's clear, as Christians, especially in light of the nearness of the end, we are to be alert and sober-minded. That is, we're not to be distracted, but we are to be disciplined and focused. And for what purpose? Well, for the purpose of prayer. Brings to mind Jesus' words to his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26:41. He tells them, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Friends, the nearness of the end should drive us to pray. There should be an increasing sense of urgency in our prayer life. We should be careful not to let the things of the world, whether social media, technology, Netflix, or whatever, dull our spiritual senses, pull us away from God, or distract us from our prayer life. We are to be a praying people and a praying community. For friends, prayer is but an expression of our dependence, our humble dependence upon God. And guess what prayer does? It reminds us as well of the brevity of life and of the urgency of the hour. It reminds us of what is truly important, what is truly eternal. So friends, we need to pray. I'm not sure about you friends, but if you're like me, boy, I felt convicted while preparing this. I need to pray more. I'm sure all of us here, we can improve in our prayer life somewhat. So as a practical step that we can take, let's just ask ourselves, what are some things in our lives that, whether knowingly or unknowingly, may be usurping the place of prayer? What are some practical steps we can take to cultivate a more consistent and robust prayer life? Maybe for some of us, it might be disciplining ourselves not to check our phones or laptops until we have spent time with God in His Word and in prayer. And maybe for others of us, it might be studying or reading good books about prayer as a means of stirring our appetite for prayer and communion with God. Or maybe even looking into those prayer warriors in the church, people like Claire and whatever else, go to them and see what makes them tick in the discipline of prayer. And friends, just by way of encouragement, just think about it for a moment. What a great privilege we have as God's people to be able to approach and commune with God, the living God, in prayer. This is a blood-bought privilege and blessing that we have as believers. So let's treasure and let's cherish this in our lives. Well, friends, not only are we to be vigilant in prayer, we are also to be earnest in love. He says, above all, maintain constant love for one another, since love covers a multitude of sins. Now, friends, it's no secret here that love is the central and cardinal virtue of the Christian life. And that's why Peter starts off with these words, above all. Right? He's reminding us here of the priority of love. Love is to characterize our lives as believers. And when placed in the context of the persecution that the original readers were experiencing, Peter's exhortations here make tremendous sense. Friends, the thing is this. When persecution against Christians grow hotter, our love for one another must grow deeper. We are to be a loving and supportive community in times of unrest. Friends, our love for one another is to be constant, it is to be genuine, it is to be sincere, it is to be earnest and fervent. And Peter gives us a reason why we ought to have such relentless love for one another as a community of believers. In verse 8, he says, since love covers a multitude of sins. Right? Peter is here quoting from Proverbs 10, verse 12, which says, hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all offenses. And friends, if we read between the lines, what this means, I think, is that Peter assumes that we will sin against one another. That's the reality. As sinners doing life together in community, it's inevitable that we might hurt one another from time to time. We might step on each other's toes from time to time. And that's why Peter calls us to show constant love to one another. For love, he says, covers a multitude of sins. But what does Peter mean by that? Well, we know what Peter doesn't mean. Right? He doesn't mean that our love covers, that is, atones for sin. For we know that only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus can atone for sins. So what then does Peter mean? Well, I believe that Thomas Schreiner hits the nail on the head when he says that when believers lavish love on others, the sins and offenses of others are overlooked. In other words, it is a love that models the love and forgiveness of Christ, a love that forbears, that willingly and readily lets offenses slide, that keeps no record of wrongs. And that's what is needed, friends, if we are to uphold the unity of God's people, of which Christ died to purchase. Well, thirdly, as an outflow of that love as well, we are also to show hospitality. We are to be joyful in hospitality. Verse 9. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Right? Simple, straightforward, and direct. But the term hospitality here is a compound word that literally means love of strangers. And what this implies is that we are to show love and care not just to those whom we are familiar and comfortable with in church, but even to those who may be different from us. Right? We are to welcome and embrace such ones. We are to welcome them into our homes, and more importantly, into our hearts. Right? That's the kind of community that we are to be as God's people as we live and navigate our way in a hostile world. And notice, by the way, how we are to do it. We are to do it without complaining. Now, why does Peter add that? Well, I think Peter knows that showing hospitality can, at times, be costly and inconvenient. I'm sure all of us here, if you're hospitable before, you probably know what I mean. And that's why he exhorts and encourages us to do it gladly and joyfully, and not unwillingly and begrudgingly. And friends, perhaps it might help us to remind ourselves that all that we have, our homes, our food, our money, they all belong to God anyway. And we are meant to use them to bless others. So let's strive, friends, by the grace of God, to be a hospitable people. Now, first, I know Heather and Bolage, they have a great system of showing hospitality. From what I know they try to invite different groups to their place for lunch, not every Sunday, every fortnight to their place. I think it's a very good system, great practice, and it's highly commendable. And I know that many of us here as well, we are doing something similar, and that's great and fantastic. So let's keep up the great work, and let's seek to be a hospitable people, a hospitable church. Now, fourthly, and finally, we are to be faithful in service. Verse 10, just as each one has received a gift, use it to serve others as good stewards of the varied grace of God. All right, just a few quick observations from this verse. 1, God is the giver of gifts. 2, each of us has received at least one gift. 3, we are stewards of these gifts. And 4, as good stewards, we are to use the gift that we have received to serve others. Simple. So with this in mind, some questions we can ask ourselves are as follows. What are some gifts that God has given us? What are we doing with these gifts? How faithful are we in using our gifts to serve, bless, and build up the body of Christ? And in light of the end that is to come, are we ready to give an account to God for how we have used the gifts He has given us? So this is no rocket science. Right, let's be faithful to use whatever gifts God has given us to serve, bless, and build up the church. For gifts are not meant for our personal edification or personal fulfillment, but for the edification and fulfillment of the church. Move on, verse 11. If anyone speaks, let it be as one who speaks God's words. If anyone serves, let it be from the strength God provides. Right, Peter here, he splits the gifts into two broad categories, that of speaking gifts and that of serving gifts. And friends, we all have gifts that fall into one or both of these categories. And Peter's point here is simply to remind us that whatever gifts we've been given, whether speaking or serving, we have to use them faithfully in reliance on the power and strength that God provides. And friends, notice the goal and purpose of all of this. It is so that God may be glorified through Jesus Christ in everything. To Him be the glory and the power forever and ever. And that, friends, should be our goal and purpose in life. As the Westminster Shorter Catechism puts it, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Well, friends, as we close, let me just say this. Like the original recipients of 1 Peter, we are living in the last days. And friends, this fact should help us understand and make sense of the sufferings that we, as God's chosen exiles, may encounter for our faith as we live in this hostile world. And this should also motivate us to live faithfully and resolutely for the will of God, knowing that the judge is standing at the door, ready to judge the living and the dead. And these, friends, should also inspire us to be a vigilant, loving, and serving community as we await the the return of the King. Why not we pray? Father, we do thank you, Lord, for your word which penetrates our hearts, the deepest recesses of our hearts, and exposes, O God, the areas we may have fallen short. But Father, we thank you that in you, O God, there is forgiveness and there is grace, O God. Father, I pray, as we have learned today, that we are in the last days, and we should not be surprised of the trials that may come our way. And Father, I do ask and pray, Lord, for your grace to be upon all of us here as your people. Help us, O God, to be resolute in living out the will of yours in our lives, and help us to live in light of the end as we just do community together and just serve one another and build up your church and reach out to the lost, for we know that you are coming soon. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.